Lightning like Steve McQueen. I'm in the fast lane when the light turns green. And I built tough, I ain't nothing but grit. Cause I made rugged blood, sweat, and spit. Yeah, like a horse I fly. Better push yourself in for a bumpy ride. I like to play hard, but I work harder. And I weather the storm cause I'm built stronger.
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back. We are live. It is the Freight Coach Morning Show, the top morning show in transportation, coming to you guys every single weekday, 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 10:30 Central, to break down some industry headlines and, most importantly, provide some actual insight into what you can do with all of this information. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. This is the real side of freight, ladies and gentlemen. And I say that before every single show. And what I mean by that is I only speak to transportation professionals on this show, as well as my twice-a-week long-form podcast, because I want to talk to the right individuals who have done what you're looking to do, or who are currently doing what you're trying to achieve, so you can take that information, apply it, utilize it, and see a meaningful difference in your business and your life. Carla Isted, good morning to you. I'm just going to jump right in, you guys. Corey Buchan, happy Monday over on YouTube. I'm going to bring my guest on up, you guys. We're going to talk about the Port of Baltimore. What actually is going on out there? What are the implications? Where are things potentially heading? So I got my man Steve Ferreira back on the show. He's my guy for all things ocean everything. So Steve, thank you so much for joining me here.
Chris, great honor to be with you again. Good morning and welcome to your audience. You've got a great show. Thanks for having me.
No, of course, man. It's, there's obviously been a lot of things that are kind of coming out, right? And, I know that obviously the reason why I do my show every single day is to bring subject matter experts on, such as yourself, to talk about topics that affect the transportation industry, because, there's a big difference between, people who report to get some clicks and downloads, as opposed to people who are like, no, here are some real implications. So, what are you hearing out there, man?
Well, Chris, it's interesting. The Baltimore situation is a multi-dimensional, multifaceted animal. And I think, before I even begin to give some commentary, and I'm glad to answer any direct questions you have, obviously our hearts and our minds go out to the workers and the people that lost their life and were injured in that. Obviously, that could have been a lot worse than it was from a human life perspective. It's a horrible tragedy, and we get that. And our hearts and our souls go out to the loved ones. With that said, I think that it's interesting. I have to take a step back and look at this as a very interesting blip, right? You look at Baltimore, and now I grew up in the Northeast, and I trained 40 years ago in those ports, and I know those ports like the back of my hand. New York, Howland Hook, Baltimore. Reality is that Baltimore doesn't really even crack the top 10 in the US, right, in terms of overall tonnage. Now, it's a key port for some very interesting commodities like autos, coal, steel, and plywood. But it's not the port that you might necessarily say, okay, this is where all the blank footwear is going, or this is where all the high-end computers are going, or this is where all the high-end auto parts are going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And because that was kind of my thing is you hear some implications where, like they're the top port of this, but I think people also at times tend to fail to realize how many ports we actually have out there, and then how some of them are commodity specific at the end of the day. And it seems like auto was kind of the main commodity that went in and out of Baltimore, was auto and like heavy machinery and stuff like that.
Yeah, now I'm a real big follower of some of the financial stocks that have to do with shipping, both containers and auto carriers. Like Wellenius is a good carrier, is a good company, and they basically said they're going to probably take a $10 million hit on their car carrier business. But when you look at billions of dollars in revenues, a $10 million hit is, and again, I say with peace and love, it's important, but it doesn't register so that, investors would pull out of that. And it's very interesting, right? The day that this happened, I do follow a lot of the energy stocks and some of the coal stocks that the coal companies that are out of Baltimore, their stocks went down 10, 12%. But by the next day, they sprang back to life, as I think the public and those in the, not the public, but those in the business understand that there's a lot of different alternatives. And this brings me to the point that I wanted to talk about, is I started in the container ocean business in 1982, and I remember I was based in Boston, and at the time, the ocean carrier that I worked for was called the original United States Lines, and U.S. Lines didn't have a container service to Boston, right? So how did it work? Well, basically, the container ship would come into New York, and it would be, we call it motor bridge, up to Boston. That's a
Mhm.
very common term in ocean. And so I think the fidelity of kind of what's happening with the trade in general. Now, don't get me wrong, right? There are some great importers and exporters in that Baltimore area. Sporting goods, one sporting goods company comes to mind primarily. And so the way that they might handle their business going forward with Baltimore is it just goes into Norfolk or New York and it's motor bridged, back to the Baltimore area DCs. So I think you're right in going back to where the commodities impacted are a lot of the aluminum scraps, the metals, and one thing too we have to keep in mind, Chris, is that um, there was some luck involved in, you could call it, a tragic situation in what happened with the bridge, the key bridge, in that the vessel was actually on its way out to the next port of call, which in this case happens to be Sri Lanka, Colombo. Now, when you start to think about ports in the Indian subcontinent, West Asia, these are typically low value cargoes.
Yeah.
For example, some processing materials for refining or scrap metal, perhaps waste paper. Believe it or not, even one of the big big cargoes that gets shipped to a place like Sri Lanka is used clothing. Right, there's an incredible used clothing market there in that country where they take our remnants of excess, fabric that was thrown away and not able to be processed, and they sell it there. So again, relatively, we got a little bit lucky, right, that it wasn't filled with high end stuff, and there was more of the low valued items, Chris.
So I've, obviously like the gift and the curse of today's day and age is information can spread fast, and that information might be completely off base. It might be completely accurate, but I had saw something out there on social media from a guy who claims to like I mean, he seemed credible, right? Like he was saying all the right stuff, and how some of these ships are like the maintenance is like because these ships run on like razor thin margins. So like maintenance isn't like as high as a priority out there as like the airlines, for example, and stuff like that, because they can get away with a lot more on an ocean liner. And then there was reports that this specific ship had issues going into the port of Baltimore. Like they were having issues with their power and everything else. And then it seems like on the way out is when it actually caused, the real issue. So did you hear that as well? Can you speak on that at all?
Yes, I think I made a good analogy in preparation for our chat today and thinking this through a little bit. And we talked a little bit pre-show and how as breaking news today that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has started an investigation on the incident,
Mhm.
and what that might mean in general. And again, allegedly, it could potentially mean that there was some knowledge of these defects, or perhaps not. Perhaps crew members may have known, and they're trying to determine, well, why did the ship leave the port in the first place if it did have a problem? But here's the thing I want to talk about. I think that it's really interesting. I think the FBI investigation led me to kind of crystallize this, and I think it's important for your audience. I fly a lot, as you do, and we all do. And sometimes I'm sitting closer up front, and I always love to see the give and take between the pilot and maintenance staff. And if you're flying a Airbus or whatever the model is, each plane has this incredibly precise logbook, right?
Yep.
Oh, the left aileron was adjusted 0.11 degree. I mean, they're very precise. So just like a airline has a kind of a logbook and a black box, so doesn't a vessel, right? And I think that's probably some of the things that go into the investigatory mechanics of what they would look at. Okay, how is the logbook, right? What was the result of the logbook? And I'm reminded about for example, Air Alaska had a tragic accident 10, 15 years ago where the jack screw wasn't lubricated properly. Now,
Yeah.
how is that mentioned in the logbook? You follow me. I think that this is a key, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an issue where, and again, this is just me thinking with my 40 years of experience, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, they just let an issue go, but
Yeah.
perhaps it was just the way it was documented or not documented. Might be a better way to look at it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. It makes perfect sense, right? And I think like the main thing for me is as big of an issue as a lot of these things are, and especially when it comes down to like a port being shut down. I think it's like it's very imperative that people take a second to let some of these details come to light on, assessing what actually happened here, because like again, I think like frankly, when it boils down to it, everything's still operated by a human. Humans make mistakes. Technology makes mistakes at the exact same time as well. And there's a lot of details out there that need to come to light about what actually happened to these to the ships and everything else. And again, I think if you're looking at it from a statistics perspective, when's the last time that this has happened? When's the last time that a ship hit a bridge and shut down a port? I mean, I don't ever remember this happening in my life.
Well, it's not quite the same, but I think, if you look back in 2021 when the Ever Given had the infamous issue in the Suez
Oh yeah,
Canal,
yeah.
it's not exactly hitting a port bridge, but I think that so we tend to be, and I think there's I think sometimes the media has a little bit of a taste for the blood, so to speak, and I don't mean that in any negative way, but I mean I know one of the media outlets, and this kind of a great colleague in the industry and veteran, Ted Prince, commented on this on LinkedIn and was talking about how one of the networks had a live shot of, and Chiron said first containers sent by rail coming into the port of Baltimore, right? And it was trying to illustrate how the infrastructure is now flip-flopping so that these containers can still come into the Baltimore area except by rail instead of ocean. And
Yeah.
the funny thing about it is when they this media company did this shot, they said, here's the train coming in with all the containers. And yeah, it's true. The containers were coming in, but they were all domestic containers. They had nothing to do with ocean freight.
Yeah.
And so this is something that the public just didn't know, right? And Ted Prince was the first one to call this out. I had noticed it before, but I didn't say anything about it. But it was just interesting because the press tends to get a lot of this information in half truths, and that can be dangerous as well, as you know.
Yeah. And that's kind of my whole thing is because I try my best to not comment on some stuff until I have a chance to talk to people who are way more well versed than I had, because I was more talking about like the trucking side of things and how it will affect the flatbed market because like naturally they're going to have to get all those containers out of there and reposition to other markets and how that could all, I almost viewed it as like the natural disaster effect, Steve. When there's a hurricane in Florida, for example, it affects the entire southeastern freight, domestic US freight market and stuff like that. And that was kind of the extent of what I had kind of talked about. And, I brought up that one gentleman who was talking about how maintenance on these things are, not a priority and how margins are razor thin and this and that. And, and then now when I saw that, the FBI was investigating it this morning, I'm starting to think that maybe there was a little bit more that people could have been done, but, because there's been enough time where they've, like you brought up the black boxes and everything, they've definitely combed through all that data. And I feel like the next progression, if the FBI comes in, they probably found some stuff in there. They're like, hey, it's either a human error or, something happened enough to where they're going to go and investigate this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that's one of the reasons why they jumped in. But I think there's another really important aspect that your audience might find helpful or even somewhat useful. This is very different than when you've heard these horror stories about. There was actually the One Network Express had a vessel a few years ago, 5 years ago. It was called the Aptos, and it lost over 2,000 or 3,000 containers overboard during a sea storm. Right,
Yep.
that were in the Trans-Pacific. Those containers were gone. Very high value stuff, computers, iPhones, whatever it is, Chris. I think the interesting thing about it here is that, remember, as I said in my intro, these are relatively low value items
Yep.
going to processing smelter plants and whatever in the Middle East and subcontinent. And so only a few containers, and when I say few, let's say 100, maybe had gone overboard. But I think the nice thing is, if there is a silver lining, is a lot of these are commodities. And so as long as they come off the vessel intact, they can be re-smelted, resold. So the loss of cargo value was relatively low in this case. And then the other flip side of that is that because this was going to another foreign location, it's going to be there's going to be more impact on importers in Sri Lanka and in the Middle East that have foreign insurance companies that these
Yeah.
claims will have to go through. So I think the much ado. This is horrible to say. I don't want to say much ado about nothing with the Baltimore incident, but I think given the totality of what we've seen, we kind of uh, escape this in a good way. First off, the Baltimore police, the state police, the Bridge Patrol, the Maryland Ports Authority did a phenomenal job, right? Closing off that bridge to prevent
Yeah.
more loss of life. I think let's give them credit where credit is due. And then as far as the vessel's concerned, I think you hit the nail on the head, Chris. I think that, obviously the FBI doesn't just step in for an exercise. Maybe there's some smoking gun there that we do or don't, that is real or not real. And they've got to investigate that, because the reality is this bridge will probably cost $1 billion to replace, and that's not chump change.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly it, right? So it's like, because with you, with what you do, for your day job, I should put it, Steve, is so you're out there with ocean audit, so you're
Right.
dealing with a lot of the freight related. Yeah, I don't want to call it. Is it freight claims, or like if there's any loss of value and stuff like that? So you're
Right.
very well versed in the flow of cargo and like the and all of that stuff that goes on out there. So like when you see stuff like this, and like I mean, with anything that was destined to go into the port of Baltimore, for example, all
Right.
and you brought up earlier about how in the when you worked at the port of Boston, everything had to go in through New York, and then it was essentially
Mhm.
trucked up from there. Was
That's right.
it doesn't seem like it was that, and I don't want to ever make this sound like that what happened wasn't a big deal, but from a cargo flow perspective, it seems like they were able to reroute everything that was inbound Baltimore in a timely manner. And then essentially that just goes down to what the like Newark or Wilmington, Delaware, or something like that, the closest port of entry in a port. And then it just gets offloaded there and then drayed up or trucked in from there.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you say that. I mean, we almost saw this go into play immediately. Within 4 or 5 days of the incident, vessels were already being rerouted to Norfolk, Virginia, for example, instead of Baltimore, where those cargoes would be offloaded. I ran the ship's log on everything that Dali ship, it was called the Dali, had on it, and it was interesting because, I mean, I've been around for 40 years, and
Yeah.
I think I know every importer name and every exporter name there is. I'll tell you what, Chris, I looked at the top 50 names on that vessel, and a lot of them were new to me. It's only because I tend to follow more of the mainstream kind of retail commodities as opposed to these newspaper and
Yeah.
newsprint. And don't get me wrong, all my clients ship all kind of commodities, but even the top um, importers, exporters on that vessel surprised me, because I didn't recognize, they weren't household names that
Yeah.
could tell you, oh, hey, Chris, you know that so and so had 20 containers on that vessel, and you'd look at me like I've never heard of them. And I would say the same thing. And I've been in the trade for 40 years. So I think it's one of those things where there was a little bit of luck. But as I said, there are great companies in that region that have, Fortune 500 companies that you'd recognize right away that have, 2 containers on it or 3 containers on it.
Yeah.
And they can learn to adjust that. It's not like the Aptos case where an individual company might have lost 70 of their containers, which is much more difficult to replace, Chris.
So where does it go forward from here? Now, like, is every port out there in the United States that has a bridge in line with, a shipping route, for example, are they going to be all reassessed and being like, is there air, like what could potentially come from a safety improvement factor here? You know, are they going to assess the layouts of all these ports? Is having a bridge that runs over like that in the port of Baltimore kind of, you know, few and far between? Not a lot of them have that. Again, I haven't visited every single port in the United States of America, and I'm not going to try and act like I do, but how do we improve safety from here?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, that key bridge was built before a certain timeline where these so-called almost like a shin guard or chest protectors were built around the pier. So if the Baltimore Bridge had these, there's a technical name for it, but let's just call it a buffer or a barrier, almost like a steel encasement around the anchor of the bridge. This Baltimore Bridge did not have those, and so if it did, there's a good chance that we wouldn't have had a tragedy. Many of the newer bridges have this mandatory so-called buffer zone, where even if a ship hits it, it's hitting the exterior of this very iron, solid material, this bridge or buffer, before it hits the pillar of the bridge. You follow me? And so I think the issue there is there was just another incident where one of the ships was in distress near the Verrazano Bridge in New York. And I don't know whether the Verrazano was built to have these accordion protectors or not. However, I think that was a little overblown too, because it's like, okay, here's the second vessel that had an engine failure and it was close to a bridge. So it's almost like, oh, Chicken Little. You know, it's people are starting to call it out. But it's a fair issue because obviously when this bridge gets rebuilt, it's going to have the latest and greatest safety standards. But I would say that similar to the way our ports are a little bit subpar to some of the global ports. For example, totally separate issue, but you know, even in the 1980s, the port of Rotterdam, you know, was autonomous. There was a lot of autonomy in that port, and you know, our ports have nowhere close near to the efficiencies of some of the European and Asian ports. So if you go back to the topic of infrastructure and you include bridges in infrastructure, it just so happens this was a bridge that was, you know, at the foot, the mouth of the port of Baltimore, and so you almost had a perfect storm, so to speak, when this went down. Therefore entombing, you know, maybe 6 or 7 or 10 vessels that still can't get out. Now, these are minor. I don't mean to belittle the owners of these vessels. These are minor vessels. They're not, you know, they're not strategic vessels. There are a couple Navy vessels that are not able to get out. But again, we're only talking about maybe 2 or 3 of those that can be easily, you know, reconnoitered from another location. So,
well, we're always looking to build more ships for our Navy. So here we go. Looks like we just got a couple of
be a reason, right? Right.
Yeah, exactly. No, I just, you know, because I look at it like this, and in a lot of it, you know, it seems like, and again, not trying to discredit what anything's going on out there, but I'll use the airlines for an example right now. Ever since that unfortunate incident on the Alaska Airlines Boeing recently, where that plug door blew out, now it seems like every time you pull up the news, it's flight was delayed due to this and that and everything under the sun. And I almost wonder how common was all of this stuff before, but now since it's the next hot topic to talk about, it's going to get a lot more press. That almost stokes more and more fear out there than what is actually needed in these instances, because I would have a feeling that, you know, everything that happened over these last couple of years, there's definite contingency plans that are out there to reroute all the flow of goods, which you've already mentioned. And that, you know, again, it's an issue, but it's not a crippling to our entire infrastructure. But I think it does shine a light on the thing that what I think is our biggest threat out there essentially is our infrastructure is kind of crumbling, man. Our ports are, like you mentioned, are years behind ports in Asia and Europe. Our airports are dated. Our freeway system is dated. And it's like, we need to reinvest back in and rebuild our infrastructure. Like, because, you know, John Radvansky brought up here that some of the bridges in Houston can take a hit due to buffer zones and everything going in and out of there. And,
That's
you know,
right.
you brought that up, like, how many bridges out there, for example, don't have that? And then now, like, that's a thing. Like, we got to reinvest in our infrastructure here, because it's like that. I feel like a lot of that gets overlooked. And I'd like, this is what I mean, but like, we got to take care of ourselves before we can take care of anybody else.
Yeah, just one closing comment on that. So I think the other thing too that's really important for the public and your viewing
Yeah.
audience to realize is that if you look at the vessels, right, and you look at some of these older vessels, and then your audience might say, oh my gosh, if they're going to go look now vessel by vessel, that means that it's going to be an upgrading on the vessels. It's going to cost more money. Those costs are going to be passed on to my cargo. I think there's another way to look at that is that I think in the ocean industry, the older the vessel, it makes it much more likely that that vessel will actually be sold for scrap rather than go through any kind of extensive
Yeah.
mechanical replacement. So I think that your audience can breathe a little bit more easier that this doesn't necessarily mean like Boeing, they're going to have to go through everything and then it results in more costs. I don't think that at all. I think that this was a one-off event, a rogue event that just happened, and that there's a good chance. Well, now obviously this vessel will most likely be scrapped. I don't see it being repaired at all because the cost would be too elaborative.
Yeah. No, I think that, yeah, again, there's always, I think that it's also an unfortunate reminder that things do happen, but at the end of the day, this is how, unfortunately, this is how improvements are made, right?
That's
Like,
right.
why are airlines the safest way to travel? Like by eons, like not even by a little, like by a lot. It's because unfortunately things have happened. But then what happens from that though is you build up contingency plans. Like there's going to be new safety measures that are going to come through all of this stuff in. And I would argue, I would probably rely on the fact that all of our ports are going to be getting an upgrade here. I would say there's going to be new safety procedures that are going to be put out there. There's probably going to be a lot more buffer zones that are going to be put inside of some of these shipping lanes that cross, that come even remotely close to resident. I don't want to call it residential traffic, but like, what I understand, but like by,
Right.
yeah.
I think that at the end of the day, you just jumped on something. I just picked my son up yesterday, who came back from touring his college that he's going to be going to this fall, and he was saying, "Oh, Dad, it was kind of bumpy when we landed, and I was a little nervous." I said, "Don't worry, this is the safest mode to travel," and I think it resonated when he told me that yesterday, as well as what you just said today. With that said, I mean, obviously, in the air, accidents can happen, but I think that I would look towards, unfortunately, more accidents happening with rail, right, and also ships, because the infrastructure in our rail lines and our ship lines are not as good as the air infrastructure. So I think we still have to be very cautionary, especially when it comes to rail and chemicals. Look what happened in Ohio with those
Yeah.
spills, or Indiana, excuse me, I'm not sure where it was. But I think that that's a very tangential issue to the whole supply chain that both you and I, even though we're diverse in our uh, professional portfolios, we need to be engaged in.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right? And I also I want to, push people to actually do some more than surface level research on the people that you're listening to in a lot of these instances, right? Like, why have I not extensively covered this in particular? Because I'm not an ocean freight expert. Steve is. So, like I said, Steve's been doing this longer than I've been alive, and I'm almost 40. Okay. So that's the thing is I want to have Steve come on here and talk about stuff like this.
Thanks,
Because he
Chris.
can bring different insights out there as opposed to somebody who's just trying to make a fucking TikTok and sound like a genius on these subjects. And that's just not the case, right? Like, again, nobody's discrediting what happened, but there's a story to be told in all of these things. If we just wait 5 minutes, essentially, and
That's
then
right.
more information will come out. There'll be more things that we can kind of digest. And then most importantly, we can come up with a plan moving forward here. So make sure you guys reach out and follow Steve. Steve talks about ocean freight all the time. And anytime that there's anything ocean related, I reach out to Steve almost immediately. I'm like, when can you come on the show, man? We got to talk again.
I love you, man.
Hey, Steve, I appreciate it. And you guys will be back tomorrow. We're not going to be going live a couple of days this week because I'm going to be actually out on the road visiting some customers of mine. But yeah, we'll be going live tomorrow as well as Friday. As always, you guys, if you guys got value in what you heard, subscribe to the show, you guys. Share it out there to your network, because if you see value, your network will see value as well. I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. And we'll be talking to you soon.